So welcome everybody to today's session. I'm Sally from HEMPIC Menopause in the Workplace, the Menopause Friendly Accreditation and the Menstruation Friendly Accreditation. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Vickie Williams, who's one of our Menstruation Friendly Independent Panel members, to talk all around endometriosis, in particular, hearing from Vickie's experience, because Vickie's really been driven by her own experience, and she's recently completed her PhD in People and Organisation at the Open University, focusing on endometriosis and the workplace and the impact of menstrual policy. Before her PhD, Vickie spent 7 years in digital account director in film and creative agencies in London, and really then focusing on women's health and establishing her own business to support individuals with endometriosis and other gynaecological, if I can get my words out, conditions. And Vickie shared her experience around endometriosis on prominent venues, so Guy's and St Thomas Hospitals, International Critical Management Studies Conference. And we're really looking forward to hearing and understanding more about Vickie's experience. So Vickie, welcome to today's session.
Get my audio on. Hi everyone, it's really great to be here today. Thank you for having me.
So I thought, Vickie, we'd just start with the an introductory question, really just to understand and help people understand, what is endometriosis?
Yeah, of course. So endometriosis, it's often quite a mouthful as well. So if anyone wants to use the word endo for ease, it sometimes can be quite helpful. So endo affects 1 in 10 women worldwide, and that's 1.5 million women here in the UK. The medical definition of endometriosis is tissue resembling the lining of the uterus that's found outside of the uterus. And just to break that down a little bit, so if we think about the lining of the uterus, which is called the endometrium, it's thick, it's quite dense, and it's built to grow tiny humans, essentially. So in other words, it's built for growth. So similar tissue, what happens then when this similar tissue grows onto the ovaries, for example, or it's invading other organs such as the bladder, the bowel? Endometriosis tissue has also been found on the brain, the heart, chest, the lungs, sorry, and also even at places like the sciatic nerve. So the endometriosis tissue also behaves very similar to the endometrium in that it breaks down and sheds. And this is where the problem occurs. So there's nowhere for this tissue to escape to, what we have with menstruation. So essentially it's trapped within the body, and that causes inflammation, scar tissue, adhesions, and a whole host of really unpleasant symptoms. And those symptoms are really wide ranging. So they can range from really heavy and painful periods, back and leg pain, gastro issues such as bloating, constipation, diarrhea, also pain when going to the toilet, pain when having sex, infertility, depression. The list just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, and I think us understanding the breadth of symptoms, I think, is really important. I think maybe just sharing a little bit about your own experience. I know you said at the beginning you're not feeling necessarily the best today, and I think it's talking really openly about that.
Yeah, so I mentioned to Sally just before the call that I'm having quite an bad endo pain day, and it's really difficult to manage in a work context, because when those symptoms come on, you don't know whether it's just a little niggle or whether it'll develop throughout the day. So excuse me if I can't find my words today properly. And just to mention with the symptoms as well, they are highly individualized symptoms. So everyone experiences endometriosis completely different. My own experience started when I was 11. So I started fainting just before I started my period. And it took me 10 years to be diagnosed. And that's 10 years of going back and forth to the doctors repeatedly, being told that it's all in my head, it's just a bad period, I'm one of the unlucky ones. And when I was diagnosed, it coincided with me starting my first job, which was really difficult getting to grips with, your new work and routine, but also a routine trying to manage symptoms on the side, and often kind of in silence. I just found that endometriosis completely disrupted everything. So, you know, from the social side, I was constantly having to cancel plans with friends and family. It interfered with relationships. But work was it had a huge effect on my work. And I remember one particular incident when I was sat at my desk, and I just remember feeling as if this bomb had gone off in my pelvis. It was the worst pain that I'd ever experienced. So I asked my manager if I could leave work, and I headed straight to A&E. And in order to get on top of the pain, I was placed in an induced menopause. And as the doctor was doing that, I just remember my phone going off, and it was an email from my boss who had warned me that I'd left without giving a handover. And as you can imagine, when you're in a really high level of pain, giving a handover is the last thing that you've got on your mind before leaving work. And these similar experiences really cropped up throughout my career of people not really understanding, it being misunderstood as simply just a bad period again. And it was during the same time that I started teaching yoga. So I was really drawn to yoga for the relief it brought to my own symptoms, but also the perspective that it gave me of living with a long-term condition. So I'd never ever planned to teach, fell into teaching, and I set up endo sharing circles with a friend called Jessica Duffin, and she's now the endo belly coach. And if you're not familiar with her work, she's absolutely fabulous. I really recommend you looking at her work. We set up endo sharing circles, and it was a mixture of movement, meditation. There was some self-coaching techniques, advice on nutrition. And it was during those circles that I really started to realize how much of an impact working with endometriosis was for people. So many people shared their experiences of having to have repeated time off, you know, losing out financially or on promotions, and also how discriminatory their experiences were. So it really made me realize how much of an issue working with the condition was. And it wasn't until later when I was sat in a gynae room, which had become my second home, which I know will be familiar to many people listening to this. And I remember looking around and just seeing so many women working on their laptops around me, which I can only imagine that they were working. And I just thought to myself, in what world do we live in that we can't even come to a hospital appointment about a pretty serious condition without feeling guilty about the need to continue working? And then that's where the idea of the PhD was born then, of researching the experiences of working with the condition, and then what type of support might be able to help that experience as well.
Yeah, and from the research that you've done and those endo sharing circles, what are the kind of stories that you're hearing in terms of how is this impacting people in work? What are the kind of challenges people face on a day-to-day basis in the workplace?
I think the biggest challenge, so it starts before work, and the biggest challenge with endometriosis is the diagnostic delays. So currently that's between 8 to 12 years. And since COVID, that time has actually gone up. And endometriosis is often called the missed disease because of the wide spectrum of symptoms that come up. It often means that people are being misdiagnosed with other conditions, such as IBS is quite a common one, but also the normalization of menstrual pain, which on a side note is the only type of pain that we normalize within society and that we think is okay. But because of the connection of endometriosis to menstruation, it's often just dismissed and ignored. Jennifer Block has a really, she wrote the book, Everything Below the Waist, and she has a really good phrase where she said, you know, you might be familiar with this story. Woman needs medical care, woman is ignored, woman has to fight. So that fight starts before the workplace. And it takes an average of around 7 GP visits to get referred to a specialist. And even then, you might be misdiagnosed. But the biggest issue, and where it comes into play with work, is that you're left without the evidence to prove your suffering. So in other words, the burden of proof falls on you, to be able to prove, you know, even to family and friends, that you've got a condition, that it's not just bad period pain. But the biggest issue is obviously explaining accommodations in work, or explaining why you might need more time off. I think one of the biggest issues, though, is that there isn't a structure put in place to support people who are experiencing endometriosis. And we see that over and over again with sickness policies at work. So, for example, endometriosis, because it can fluctuate, it's unpredictable, it's also long term, which means that it's not going away. There isn't a cure for it. And often sickness policies penalise people with endometriosis for going over and above, or for instance, if they trigger the Bradford score. So instead of something being treated as a medical issue in the workplace, it's often used for grounds to exclude or penalise people. So it's transferred into a performance management issue. And it's a serious workplace issue because many women are losing out on promotions, they're losing out on, you know, economically, so in terms of pay, but also many women are losing their jobs as well. There was a study carried out across 52 countries, and over 40% of women with endometriosis had left or given up their work because of the condition and because of being unsupported.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting what you were saying there around diagnosis. We were at an event recently and someone said that they only felt confident sharing what they were experiencing with their manager, even though their manager, they had a good relationship and they felt very supported by their manager. They only felt they were able to share once they had the diagnosis. I think that's something that's really important, that we educate, that it's not about having a piece of paper that's saying if people are experiencing this, that we're thinking about how we can support. In terms of the people that are joining today that are maybe experiencing endometriosis themselves or supporting somebody, what are some of the things that somebody can do to manage symptoms they're experiencing, or ways of kind of coping? I know you talked about some of the techniques and tools you shared with the endo sharing circles. What are some of the top tips you might give somebody?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is, and it comes back to evidence as well, is that if you don't have the evidence, there's ways that you can create your own evidence. So, and as part of my research, so I asked participants to fill out diaries, as well as interviewing them on their stories. And I didn't realize how powerful diaries could be. And I think for endometriosis, they're powerful in three ways. So firstly, on a medical basis, completing a diary, so capturing your pain and your symptoms, you know, across maybe 2 or 3 months, allows you to go to your GP's office and say, right, this is what I'm experiencing. It either isn't, you know, maybe the symptoms have changed, so this isn't normal for me, or, you know, it's not right that my pain, my symptoms are stopping me from doing daily activities every day, for example. So it opens up a conversation with your GP straight away, where you can ask to be referred to a specialist. And you're really looking to be referred to, hopefully I get this right now, a BSGE centre. I hope I've got the right way around, but they're basically endo specialist centres. So they're consultants, they're surgeons, specifically trained in endometriosis, but they also come with endo specialist nurses. And through my own experience, I found the nurses to just be incredible, to be able to have that conversation. They bridge the medical and the social worlds together. So, you know, you can talk to them about the problems that you're having at work or in relationships. And I think having a conversation about endometriosis can be a relief in itself, just to be heard about your symptoms and experience, that you don't have to hide it. So secondly, diaries are really helpful in a workplace capacity. So if you're capturing your symptoms and you recognize a pattern, but just to say that sometimes there isn't a pattern, and that's very typical of endometriosis. But if there is a pattern, for example, many of my participants recognize their symptoms occurred in the morning. So they discussed with their manager being able to have a later start time. Or one participant particularly felt her symptoms were worse the week before her period. So she would organise to work from home, or even take take a day off. So it gives you that evidence to be able to, and you don't necessarily have to show your diary to your manager, but you can just say, look, I've been tracking it, this is what my symptoms are. And it starts that two-way conversation, that dialogue, where you can say, like, this is what I need, what's available. So, you know, that two-way. And then thirdly, which I think is the most important use of diaries with endometriosis, is that they can be so self-validating. If you've gone through a journey of endometriosis, of been constantly being told it's all in your head or it's just a bad period, then this is black and white, you know, your symptoms are there. And participants really love diaries. One lady in particular said she didn't realize that her pain symptoms were every single day, that she was just putting up with and grinning and bearing, as she said. Another lady used it to really capture how discriminatory her work had been to her. And I think it's so easy just to brush off experiences or, you know, lose them to the past. But having that diary there in black and white, yeah, it can be a really powerful tool to be able to act on that then. Sorry, go ahead.
No, okay. And any kind of top tips? I know you said yoga for you has been really helpful. Is there anything else in terms of kind of self-support that people can think about that may help to manage some of the really challenging symptoms, especially while someone is waiting for that referral, that medical support, because we know that is the reality for many. Anything that you found that's been particularly supportive or supportive in general?
Yeah, lots of things. So I went on a complete journey with with medicine, and experienced side effects of different things. And I think that's why I was drawn to the yoga. So gentle movement, but also tailoring your movement throughout the month. We are constantly being told that we need to perform at the same level every single day. And also exercise comes into that as well. But actually just tailoring your exercise to where you are, where you're at on a given day. Also looking at different nutritional advice. So just a personal thing here, onions trigger my endometriosis. I have no idea why. So it can be really unusual things. But again, coming back to that diary, keeping a record of things. Meditation always really helped me. Obviously, we talked about there isn't a cure for endometriosis. So we need to start moving away from this idea of how do we, you know, obviously we all want to get rid of it, but until that cure is found, how do we manage our day to day? And meditation really helped me just be able to accept where I'm at. Okay, I'm in pain. You know, how do I get through this? And breathing as well is a huge technique that I learned. I find sometimes when you're in pain, your breath we can shout, like our breath becomes quite shallow, but actually just, yeah, breathing into that pain. Yeah, I think those are the things that have really helped me, and above all else is being gentle with ourselves and not being too hard and putting too much pressure on ourselves.
Yeah, I think that we talk about a lot when we talk around other conditions, when we talk about menopause, that being kind to yourself. I think that's a really, really important thing. And just before we come to questions, just a final bit, if somebody is supporting somebody living with endometriosis, what things would you say would have made a difference to those people around you, whether that's at work, whether that's in relationships, at home, family members, anything particular that is really important that we need to be mindful of when we're supporting someone living with this?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is recognizing that endometriosis is a legitimate condition, believing symptoms when they happen, not just brushing it off as, oh, it's that time of the month, or, you know, it's PMS, but really honoring these symptoms and respecting them, because they can be pretty unpleasant. Again, as I said, understanding that it's a long-term condition, there isn't a cure, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But also facilitating those safe spaces, especially in the workplace. I think many managers feel as if they need to be an expert in women's health, but you know, that isn't the case. I think if you can just facilitate that safe space for someone to be able to come to you with their condition, what support they need, then I don't think you can ask for much more, and you know, for them to facilitate those adjustments.
Yeah, absolutely. And someone's just shared that the previous boss actually researched endo to see how he could support me, and that was really validating. And I think that people recognizing and understanding So Deborah, I'd just like to bring Deborah on and just see what kind of questions we've got coming through.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Vickie, and thank you to everyone for putting your comments in there. There's your story, Vickie, is connecting with a lot of people who are saying this sounds familiar. This is what they're experiencing. From my perspective, I'm sitting here shocked. Because when you said your diagnosis was 10 years and then you went on to say it's usually between 8 and 12, that's huge, isn't it? That's a long time to wait for a diagnosis. And I'm also conscious, Sally, that when you run menstruation training in workplaces, you often hear women saying, I didn't know it wasn't normal.
Yeah.
So many people put up with all of the things that are going on because that's the way it's always been, and they thought that's how periods were. Keeping that, having that understanding of actually this is not normal is where some of the comments are coming through around. It's really important for us to raise awareness about what's going on, because you've probably got a lot of people that are experiencing symptoms that had no idea it could be endometriosis, alongside those who know this isn't right, but then can't get somebody to listen. Is that what you're actually saying?
Yeah, absolutely. It all comes back to the normalization of menstrual pain. So we're taught generation after generation that, it is pain that we just need to get on with as women, but it's not. And then, as you mentioned, as soon as women do try and go to the GP and request help, they're told again that this is normal and they just need to grin and bear it. So at every angle, you're told that this is a normal experience when it couldn't be further from the truth.
No, and somebody's just posted to say I suffered from the age of 11 to 35 before being diagnosed. So aren't we stoic? We put up with so much without actually saying, are you sure this is right? Before we actually call it out. So absolute kudos to you, to everything that you're doing to raise awareness about endometriosis, and to yourself as well, Sally. I know that you do a lot of training about menstruation and include endometriosis, and it sounds like we do have a similar journey to go on as we have with menopause. A couple of other key things in here that we've had from people. One of the, I don't know if was it a gasp, was this is a lifetime condition. This doesn't go away. That's
Yeah,
right.
there's apparently no cure.
There's no cure.
And it's also been experienced. So some people think that pregnancy is a cure, which is a complete myth. That it's a myth that hysterectomy can cure endometriosis. And there's also experiences of endometriosis past the menopause transition. So this is a lifelong condition.
Right. And that's what I was going to get to, in terms of, for those of us that are menopausal, do the symptoms stop? Because, it's to do with reproduction, isn't it? And, you said at the beginning, creating babies. That's why the matter actually thickens. And so menopause isn't a solution either.
No, so endometriosis responds to estrogen. And because there's so many things in our environment that can mimic estrogen, it's not just the estrogen that we create within our body, but everything around us as well that can sometimes trigger that growth.
That growth, which brings on to the next question. We've got a lot of people saying, what about HRT? Does that make it better or worse? I know you're not a medical doctor and we can't give individual advice, but any sort of observations in your studies?
I haven't read anything about HRT, and that's a huge part of the research that's missing, that we don't know what the experiences are of people with endometriosis, either going through the menopause transition or that have transitioned through that journey. So that altogether, there just isn't a lot of research about endometriosis at all, and it's something that needs to be explored.
It does need to be explored, and it sounds like there needs to be a significant overhaul in terms of people knowing about endometriosis, and for that matter, not just us knowing about it, as in people in, whether it's in workplaces or in life, as you say, your partners, family members, friends, everybody needs to be aware of this, but also in terms of the medical profession. Am I right in hearing that you were saying that there are some, what did you call them, that you can escalate, you can ask for a referral?
Yeah, to I always get this wrong. So it's the British. I'll find it. It's the BSGE, so it's endo specialist centres essentially. But there's still reports today. Even in my study, there was a participant that went to her doctor. She thought she had endometriosis symptoms, and the doctor, the GP, Googled endometriosis in front of her. But even when you get to a gynaecologist, there's reports of gynecologists misdiagnosing endometriosis as well. And I think that goes back to in medical training, you know, endometriosis is such a small part of that training that a lot of medical professionals still don't know, or don't know what the route is for endometriosis. But I'd recommend people looking at the NICE guidelines as well. So that's guidelines that show what the diagnosis pathway for endometriosis should be, what the treatment should be. So they're really useful on a personal level, but they're really useful. You know, I've had a friend print them off and take them to the GP surgery and say, look, this is what you need to do. So it just puts the power back in your hands a little bit.
Yeah, so it's something that you're working through. And I've got some other people saying was misdiagnosed over and over by specialists. Thank you for sharing your story, Vickie, especially in the workplace. And I know, Sally, this is an area, did you have any sort of experience when you've been doing the training in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, the challenge around the lack of understanding, I think, both in terms of diagnosis, treatment, managing it, and lack of awareness generally in society of understanding this, whether it's at work or outside of work. And I think people have talked, I know you said about the tracking of symptoms. Are there any particular apps or ways of tracking that you found particularly useful, or is there any recommendation on how somebody does? Because I know you said about the importance of diaries.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again? My
Just
line
kind
a
of,
little bit.
sorry, any kind of specific apps or ways of tracking that you found people have found particularly useful or helpful?
Yeah, so in my research, I gave people the options to keep a written diary form or using an app, and people were nearly 50-50. But there's great apps around, like for instance, personally, I use Flow to keep a track of my symptoms, and if anything changes. I think that's one thing that we're seeing, this huge explosion of femtech and, you know, tech for our experiences, which is great. And that can be so helpful because, you know, if you've got your phone anywhere, whenever a symptom comes along, and tracking them, and then that can create patterns for you then. So that's really helpful.
So that was the tech app Flow. I've also got a question in here about the Endo Circle you mentioned.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because it looks like we've got a few people that are heading that way.
Yeah, so we haven't created one of these for quite a few years now, since COVID, and I went into my PhD into my little cave. But yeah, the sharing circles, so they were groups of around 10 to 15 women, and we would, I'm trained in women's yoga therapy. So specifically, we would look at different postures to help with, you know, menstrual cramps or pain, or, you know, simple techniques, breathing techniques when endo brain fog hits, for example. We'd also look into different nutrition. So we had a chef come at one point. So yeah, I'm thinking in my head about how we facilitate that online, because they were so helpful. And I think having, I'm also thinking as well, there's an app called Friendo, which is a community for endometriosis sufferers. So sometimes a lot of the time, it can be a very isolating condition. So this app was specifically set up for you to connect with other people that have got endometriosis, to share your symptoms, and talk about the common difficulties of living with the condition.
So that's really nice, isn't it? Because you know you're not on your own. One other question I've got, and I'm going to ask you on this one, Sally, because we have a union rep that's on the session today, and they were saying any top tips for talking to a line manager about reasonable adjustments?
Yeah, I mean, I think we cover this a lot in our training, and I think it's about for one, we've got some legal responsibilities, and I think that's always really important that we do have some protections from a legal perspective, and we need to understand those responsibilities as an organisation. But actually, it's helping to educate managers to say, if something's getting in the way of someone being their best at work, and you've got an opportunity to remove that, then why would you not want to? Because it's a massive benefit for the individual, it's a massive benefit for them as a manager, and it's a massive benefit to the organisation. So I think really it's about winning the hearts and minds of our managers, because a lot of the managers we talk to, they do want to help, but they feel a bit lost. They don't quite know what to do, and they feel that there is a barriers in way of them being able to facilitate those changes. So I think that's really, really important. But we have got sessions that we run on menstruation and employment law that would be good to look at for anyone that's wanting to explore that in a bit more detail to understand. But I think as well, just in general, I think as just trying to open this conversation and giving those shared spaces where people, as Vickie said, can actually share those experiences so they're not feeling like they're going through this on their own in an organisation, because I think that's a really, really important piece.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for all of the questions today. There's a couple, and I think, Sally, we need to commit to getting a doctor that is very familiar with endometriosis on, because we have questions about HRT, we have questions about whether the birth control, and I know what you were saying, Vickie, that it is estrogen, but there's one that's from an individual that is saying the medication that she takes daily is Zomorph and amitriptyline. I don't think I've actually pronounced that right. And she's on escalation medicine, but it actually makes her feel exhausted by the end of the day and in pain. She wants to keep herself healthy and stress-free, as that can be a trigger. But the question is, where do you go from here? And I think the first thing that we've done is having this session today, listening to your story, Vickie, seeing that so many people have similar sort of stories out there, and then perhaps we can do a couple of sessions with a doctor, Sally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to start answering some. We've got one session in our Handpicked Hub that covers some of the details around endometriosis and some of the medical treatment options, but I think there is a lot more for us to explore together.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you very much, Vickie, and thank you everyone for joining as always, and in particular sharing your stories and your experiences, because it's how we open up this conversation. So it's really appreciated, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.